Since we started Spooky History over a year ago now, we've covered several famous horror films and the true stories that inspired them. One that probably no one expected to happen was A Nightmare on Elm Street. The story of a dead child murderer with steak knives attached to each finger who kills people in their dreams, because spooky history is about facts and dreams aren't real. Way to shatter my dreams. They're just a part of childhood that is later replaced with disillusionment and eventually death. However, A Nightmare on Elm Street was indeed inspired by real events. Unlike the films we discussed previously, this one did not loudly proclaim it was based on a true story or inspired by true events. And yet it is inspired by some facts, arguably as much as some horror films which are commonly accepted as factual even when they only used a few facts and made up the rest. In an interview with Vulture, Wes Craven remembered, "I'd read an article in the LA Times about a family who had escaped the killing fields in Cambodia and managed to get to the US. Things were fine, and then suddenly the young son was having very disturbing nightmares. He told his parents he was afraid that if he slept, the thing chasing him would get him, so he tried to stay awake for days at a time. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought the crisis was over. Then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was dead. He died in the middle of the nightmare." Here was a youngster having a vision of a horror that everyone older was denying. That became the central line of Nightmare on Elm Street. Similar to Nancy Thompson in the original film, the parents discovered the boy had kept a coffee pot under his bed to keep awake and had hidden beneath his pillow the sleeping pills his parents had given him. Here we see the clear outline of Freddy Krueger and the film that popularized him. But Freddy Krueger was a serial killer and this was only one boy. Or was it? There were many other stories of people dying in their sleep in the US in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Healthy young men found dead for no reason, understood by the medical community. This news story was chronicled in 1981 from the LA Times to the New York Times. The victims, mostly men between the ages of 19 and 57, would suddenly scream in their sleep and then just as suddenly die. Scientists, autopsies, and detailed studies all failed to explain the phenomenon, and so the name given to their condition was simply based on the race which linked most of the victims rather than the cause of their deaths, as that was unknown. So it was called Asian Death Syndrome. Not all the people it killed were Asian, and not all Asians died of it, but it was the best they could do. However, to many of the people whose loved ones were affected, it was called Bangun Gut, meaning nightmare death or night terror. Most of them, as we said, were from Asia. More specifically, they were refugees from Laos and its civil war. This conflict had seen the Communist Party, known as the Pathet Lao, threaten to exterminate the Hmong people, causing many thousands of them to flee to the United States. Some people believed that this assimilation of Hmong people into American culture was itself a contributing factor to many of them dying screaming in their sleep. This shift had led to a change of their religious beliefs away from the idea of a parallel spiritual world and towards Christianity and Buddhism. But Hmong people believe that when they do not worship properly, do not perform religious ritual properly, or forget to sacrifice, the ancestor spirits cease to protect them, thus allowing the evil spirit to reach them. This theory suggested that the Hmong who died were killed by their own beliefs in the spiritual world, otherwise known as nocturnal pressing spirit attacks. But these beliefs were not limited to the Hmong people. In Indonesia it is called Dejuton, which translates to pressed on. In China it is called Bei Gi Ya, which translates to crushed by a ghost. These names suggest common symptoms of sleep paralysis, as that often leads to being unable to move, feeling that one cannot breathe, and that there is a malignant entity in the room, though we will be going into all of that in a separate episode. Theories about this mysterious cause of death include anything from an irregular heartbeat to simply being frightened to death in their sleep, which as an explanation isn't particularly helpful or comforting. Another theory concerns another recognized medical condition with a scientifically accepted name. Yay. or not. The connection to the Nightmare on Elm Street series itself would seem to qualify this eerie story for an episode, but what makes this especially creepy to me is the fact that the scientific name for this very real and recognized cause of death is Sudden Unexplained Death Syndrome, or SUDS. As in, this is obviously real and we have to call it something, but we literally have nothing to go on, so, I don't know, sudden unexplained death syndrome? get well soon. This condition is also known as sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, Lai Tai, meaning sleep and die, Dab Sog, meaning ghost, and Dolionsa, meaning sudden death. The unhelpful name is due to this syndrome being rather unhelpfully not linked to a particular people, though it does predominantly happen to young people with an Asian origin, though from populations that are culturally and genetically distinct. The first recorded case was in 1948 when 81 Filipino men in Hawaii died. Many of the hundreds of cases that occurred in the USA in the late 1970s and the early 1980s happened to people who had fled from war, as in Laos or Vietnam, though whether that helps explain their deaths or just their location is unclear. The median age of the victims is 33, so not teenagers, but not particularly old either, and again, all victims were healthy. The cause of death varies from heart disease, most often due to a heart muscle thickening oddly without any obvious cause, Brugada syndrome, medication-related causes, or rare diseases, though 20% of cases no cause of death can be found even after extensive examination. The only proven way to prevent it was with an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, though as Wikipedia very helpfully states that a diagnosis of sudden arrhythmic death syndrome is only possible post-mortem. This seems fairly difficult to plan ahead for. This unexplained and sudden syndrome with a high body count make it very easy to see what attracted Wes Craven to the news story. Death is scary, the unknown is scary, and dying one by one, never knowing what connected you, is like buying an Agatha Christie book that's missing the last chapter. But though the victims seem pre-selected, somehow the fear is also universal. Everybody has to sleep sooner or later, and in that state we are at our most vulnerable. And we all have nightmares that feel very real and dangerous. In these news articles, Craven found the embodiment for that fear with hundreds of documented victims, though he was far from the first to do so. The Hmong people called their incarnation of that fear Da Shua, a spirit said to take the form of a jealous woman. In the Philippines, the Bangungot or Betibat is not only the name of the illness, but also that of a hag-like creature that sits on the victim's face or chest so as to immobilize and suffocate him. The Dutch Nachtmerrie and our own English nightmare come from the old word mare, which wasn't a female horse, but an incubus, goblin, or demon which tormented folk through frightening dreams and lay on people's chests, suffocating them. Wes Craven took that fear, those stories, and that same need to personify it, possibly nodding to their mythological origins, with Freddy's ancient temple-like lair in the climax of the self-referential New Nightmare, a film which reframes Freddy as the latest personification of an ancient evil. To all this, Craven added a childhood memory of a creepy old man who walked along the path beside his window, stopped, stared at Craven, seemingly enjoying the boy's fear, and then went off. He gave this person the name of a childhood bully, Freddy Krueger, who had earlier also influenced the name of Last House on the Left's villain, Krug. And he gave him a red and green sweater after reading an article in a 1982 Scientific American magazine that said those two colours were the most clashing colours to the human retina. The rest is history. Spooky history. But the danger, it turned out, was very, very present. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Spooky History. You can find us on most social media at Spooky Hist Show. Thanks for watching, and please do have on second thoughts, just have bad dreams. Let's not involve any old English goblins. Goodbye.